Okay. A mitzvah kuf ayin. Ba mitzvah shivim umeya hi shetzivonu lishmoa kol shofar b'yom rishon b'yom echad mitishrei v'u amrei boi yom trua yeh lochem. So mitzvah say to hear the sound of the shofar on the first day of Tishrei. And the tzivui is Yom Trua Yeh Lochem. It doesn't talk about blowing the but Yom Trua Yeh Lochem. It should be a day. The only verb in a mitzvah has to be a verb is Yeh, and we'll see about that. So the Rambam is very clear that the mitzvah is to hear the shofar, not to blow the shofar. Lishmoa. The Rambam is of that opinion in all places that he discusses the mitzvahs. Not only here in the Minyan HaMitzvos, but also in Minyan HaMitzvos HaKotzer. Also in the Protei Mitzvahs, the beginning of Hilchos Shofar, and also in Halochos proper. And on top of that, also in a Tshuvas Rambam, we're very explicit about this. And we'll see about it in Mitzvah. The Rambam is not coming from a vacuum. He basically is coming out against the Ge'enim. Because I found two of the Ge'enim, both the Shiltais and Rav Sadi Gein, they clearly say the mitzvah is to blow the shofar. The Shiltais in Kuf Ayin Aleph, Shi'ulto the Mechayven de Beis Yisrael lemiska to blow the Chatzoitzra, which sounds like a trumpet, I don't know. B'chad b'tishrei tichsiv b'chodesh hashvi b'goyim. Also in the Sefer HaMitzvos, which was recently put together from Geniza, from Sadi Goyim, Perichof, page 197, v'tzivo liskoya b'shofar b'yom rishon b'tishrei v'ma shebia omroi yom trua yeh lochem. So interesting, on one hand, the mitzvah is derived from yom trua yeh lochem, but the conclusion is that the mitzvah is to blow the shofar, not to hear the shofar. The Rambam in Tshuva is very clear that the mitzvah is Shmiyah. It's in Shuvas Rambam, Siman Kuf Mem Beis, Hashayla Chav Daled She'ela Ma Hevdil Bein Lishmoa Kol Shofar Ubein Al Tkiya Shofar. What difference does it make if the bracha is on the Shmiyah or on the Tkiya? This is the question which Rambam was asked. What difference does it make? So the Rambam answered, Hatshuva hahevdel b'neihem godol me'ed v'zeh sha'mitzvah ha'mechuyeves eina tkiya el shmiyas ha'tkiya. If the bracha is al the shmoya kol shofar, the mitzvah is not the tkiya, but the shmiyas ha'tkiya. Vayotze mizeh, she'ilu hoyes ha-mitzvah mechuyeves hi-atkiya, or yechayev kol odom ve'odom min azchorim l'skoya. Every male Jew will be obligated to blow. And you couldn't be yotze with somebody else. Everyone had to blow. Kmo shechiv kol odom ve'odom leishe basuka b'li tolulav. the same way that everyone has to take the lulav and sit in the sukkah, and you can't have a shliach do it for you. Similarly, the blowing of the shofar would have required everyone to blow the shofar. Whether it's the business they say from the Ksayitz Mitzvah Gufo or it's a different reason, but the Ram says that Tkiyah Shofar is the equivalent to Yeshiva B'Sukkah and Tilas Lulav. V'ashomea sheloi taka lo hoye yotze yidei chayvosa v'hoye gam kein hatokeya. If the mitzvah would have been shmiyah, if a person would blow and he would not hear what the sound of the shofar, v'gam kein hatokeya sheloi shama yotze yidei chayvosa, because the mitzvah is tkiyah. Im sosam oznov tachlis hastima v'taka. If he'd be able to close his ears in a way that a sound would not penetrate, and he would blow the shofar, if the mitzvah is tkiyah, he's yotze. Hoye yotze mishum shetaka. V'ein hadova kain. That's not the case. El mitzvah he hashmiyah. Below atkiya, the ain't on taken elakadei l'shmoya. See, here's an interesting thing. So, in yeshivas they say that tkiya is the ma'aseh mitzvah. Okay. So I just want to show you what the Ram says about this. I'm just medayik in the words in the tshuva will be very clear. He says, Ela mitzvah hi hashmiyah v'lo atkiyah. V'ein onu taken ela kedei l'shmoya. The tkiyah only is to create the kol of the shofar, and the mitzvah is the kol of the shofar to hear it. Then he says he tells you a comparison to what you should compare tkiyah and shmiyah by shofar. The parallel is making the sukkah, asiyas sukkah, and sitting in the sukkah. Sitting in the sukkah is equivalent to shmiyah, and asiyas sukkah, making in the sukkah, is equivalent to tkiyah. Kamo she'amitzvah hi yeshivas sukkah lo asiyasa v'ein onu oisin ela kedei leishev. We're only making the sukkah to have a sukkah in order to sit. And he's telling you a very interesting thing. The reason why we make a bracha on the Gemara mitzvah, it's not because before is a mitzvah, but you only make on the Gemara, but before is only a hechsha and akdama, and the mitzvah is only at the end. And the mitzvah is the yeshiva b'sukkah and the shmiyas kol shofar. Unevorich lishmoa kol shofar v'lo nevorich al tkiyah shofar. So tkiyah is not a ma'aseh mitzvah; it's only a hechsha in order to have a kol shofar. L'chera, the question you should ask. I'm not going to get involved in it, but it's an interesting question. Since the tkiyah is only a hakdama, why does the person who blows the shofar have to have kavanah to mimoitzi everyone else? You understand that making a sukkah you need any kavanas. So the Rav said that there's no, he said from his Zayda that there's no mitzvah b'sheva al taseh, and ki'ilu tkiyah is the ma'aseh mitzvah. You have to have the ma'aseh, not because it is the mitzvah, but in order that you shouldn't be a sheva al taseh, doing mitzvahs in just without any action. But still, it's very confusing. If if the Rambam is serious about his comparison, that Tkiya is like Asiyas Asukah, why did he kavana lahoitzi? Okay, and why? I mean, you have to also ask yourself. I'm not going to get involved in these questions, but it's like secondary things. I'm not sure, but why does the person who blows? Why does it be Bal Chiyuva? So it means because the hechsher and you created the kol shel shofar. And the person who creates the kol shel shofar is the Bal Chiyuva. You don't have that in Sukkah. Sukkah is, all you need is that l'shem tzeil, and it doesn't have to be a Bal Chiyuva in order to make the Sukkah. So I'm not sure the comparison, the Ram is exact. It's very odd, okay? But what comes out also is very clear. If you blow the shofar and you only hear an echo, you're not yotze. But if the mitzvah be tkiya, the opposite would be the conclusion, because you don't have to hear the kol. Okay. So the question is, true, proofs in Chazal that the mitzvah is the shmiyah from the person hatakel techadus or bo, that if he blows into a pit or something like that, and you only hear an echo, you're not yotzes, you see very clear that the mitzvah is the shmiyah. But it's really passing the buck. Why is this so? Where do you see this? You true, the Matiki Ashmur, the Chachmei HaMeseira gave you this cue by saying the bracha, since we know that the bracha is L'shmo kol shofar and Tokel Techadus, and you could probably throw in the Yerushalmi that Sukkah Gzula, that Shofar Gzula Yotze with, because the mitzvah is the Kel and Akol and Gozel. That's certainly true. But the question is, how did the Chachmei HaMeseira know that the mitzvah is Shmiyah, not Tkiya? And I just want to show you that it could have been the opposite way, because you come to the mitzvah of Kuf Lamed Zayin, the mitzvah of Yovel, where you're supposed to blow the shofar. The Ram says, Liskoya b'shofar in Minyan HaKotzer. Liskoya b'shofar b'shnas Yovel, shene'emar v'valta shofar b'truah. So the question is, how did Chazal know? Why by and maybe it is true, and some Nachrim certainly claim that it's true, that on Yovel, everyone has to blow. You can't be Yotze, because the mitzvah is Tkiya, you can't be Moitzik. So I want to suggest the following. And the premise is, as the Ram says very clearly, in Cherish Bays, we derive the mitzvahs from the Psukim of Torah Shebiksav. And the Ram tells you where the mitzvahs derived from Yoit Truah Yeh Lochem. Okay. So let's now look at verbs. We know there's such a thing as a transitive verb, and there's an intransitive verb. When you talk about Va'avarta Shofar B'chol Artzachem, which is the mitzvah of Yovel, it's talking about you doing a pula. There's a verb and a command that one should do an action. However, when you look at the mitzvah on Rosh Hashanah, it says, Yom Teruah Yiyeh Lochem. Yiyeh is to be, is an intransitive verb. There's no object. And the subject is really a state of being. That there should be a state of being of a day of Teruah. So maybe the Chachmei HaMesorah asked themselves a very simple question. How could you have a mitzvah, and especially looking at Shofar on Yovel and Shofar on Rosh Hashanah, on one hand, on Yovel, it's a transitive verb, and it talks about an action. And on Rosh Hashanah and Shofar, it talks about an intransitive verb and a state of being or some state, okay? So I think it could be that Chazal derive from that the mitzvah of Shmiyas Shofar is not the blowing, the mitzvah of Yiyeh, Yom Teruah Yiyeh Lochem. You are basically a Shevi al Aseh. You are not doing anything. It's an intransitive verb, and you're Yotzei the mitzvah Shofar. And the only way that could be if the mitzvah is Shmiyah. Because the mitzvah is Tkiyah, you should have a verb like we had before, like we had in general. And what should the verb be? Va'avalta Shofar, b'chol artzecha. So it could be that's how Chazal knew that the mitzvah is Shmiyah and not Tkiyah. Now, next, the Ram says, Lishmoya Kol Shofar. What's Kol Shofar? So this Lashon of Kol Shofar is also in the Mina Mitzvah Kotzer and the Protei Mitzvos and Hilchos Shofar. And the Nusach HaBrocha is like that. The Brocha is the Shmo Kol Shofar. The Ram clearly says this in Perek Yud Aleph of Hilchos Brochos, Halacha Daled. However, interesting, in Hilchos Shofar, in Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, the Ram says, Mitzvas Aseh Shel Torah Lishmoya Truas. Truas haShekel. Rosh Hashanah. So in Mishnah Torah and Halachas proper, he says the mitzvah is the Shmoa Truas haShekel, and in the other places here in Mitzvahs, the Mina Kotzer, the Protei Mitzvahs, the Shmoa Kol Shofar. I don't think there's a machlekes. I think that it happens like this, really. Because in the Torah, it clearly says, Yom Teruah Yiyeh Lochem. So a priori, we should have sided with the Rambam in Halachas and Mitzvah say, Lishmoa Truas Shofar. Where's the Kol Shofar come from? And that's the bracha also. So I think what's happening is like this. The mitzvah mefurish b'Torah is true, but there's a pirush makubal to say that every trua has to have a tkiyah pshuta lefoneha and a pshuta leacher. And the pirush makubal expands the mitzvah. It's not only trua, but it's lishmoya kol shofar. The kol shofar then includes the trua and the tkiyas. Or if you just want to limit it to what it says in Torah Shabbat, the mitzvah is Truah. And the Ram clearly says that it's a Pirush Makubal because Mipi Hashmur is a Pirush Makubal. And the Ram in Hilchos Shofar, Perek Aleph Haloch Aleph, Pi Hashmur Lomdu, Shekol Truah Shel Chodesh Hashvi'i, Kol Truos Shel Chodesh Hashvi'i, Echod Hein, Bein B'Rosh Hashanah, Bein B'Yom Kippur. The Kol is exactly the same of Yovel and Rosh Hashanah, of Yom Kippur and Shel Yovel. Teisha Tkiya is taken, B'chol Echod Mishneim, Tkiya Uthua Utkiya, Tkiya Uthua Tkiya, Tkiya Uthua Tkiya. So the Ram is not talking here about how many colors, say 9 colors, because this is only Protei Mitzvahs. It's not a place for in Minyan HaMitzvos discuss Protei Mitzvahs. But I think there's not much of a difference. The question you're focusing on what's written in the Torah or the Pirush Makubal of Tkiya Truah Tkiya. Now, so we have now Hi Shetzivonu Lishmoya Shmiya Kol Shofar, which includes the Tkiya, the Truah Tkiya. B'Yom Rishon B'Tei Tishrei, the first day of Tishrei. V'u Amrei B'Y Yom Truah Yihiyeh Lochem. That's we talked about. The mitzvah is Yihiyeh Lochem. Ukfa Hisbaru Mishpatei Mitzvah Zo Mesechta Rosh Hashanah, Meseches Rosh Hashanah. Then Ve'ein Anoshim Chayovas Bo. Now, again, it's a mitzvah she'ez man gromo, and the way we extrapolate from the Rambam in the Akdoma to Pirush Mishnah, where he says that there was a Meseira when the Moshe Rabbeinu taught Aaron and Aaron Ubonov and the Zkenim and Klal Yisrael, he taught them the pasuk Basukas Teshuv Shivas Yom, and he taught them all the halachas. And one of the halachas was Noshim P'tuas Min HaSukkah. So it means it's not a general rule, but the P'tuas Sukkah was said in each individual mitzvah. And Chazal just extrapolated from the various P'tuim that in general, in majority of cases, a mitzvah seishes man gom and Noshim P'tuas, but it was said explicitly. And here also, it was said explicitly in the mitzvah of shofar that Noshim P'tuas. Now, let's move on. Mitzvah Kuf Ayin Aleph. I assume that this is here. I assume that this is the end of a set of mitzvahs. If you look here, cool. Yeah. He has a mitzvah of, Inu Yom Kippur. That's Kuf Mem Daled. And he talks about Shvisa and each individual Yontif. Kuf Samuch, Kuf Samuch Beis. The Sefer Kuf Samuch Aleph. Shvisa on Rishon of Pesach. Kuf Nun Tes. Kushet and Shvi. Kuf Samuch. All the Mitzvah Moadim. Then Kuf Samuch Hey, Kuf Samuch Vov, Shvisa for Melocha on Yom Kippur, Kuf Samuch Vov, Shvisa on Yom Rishon Shel Sukkos, Kuf Samuch Zayin, Shmini Shel Sukkos, Shmini Atzeres, Kuf Samuch Ches, Sukkah, Yeshiva B'Sukkah, Kuf Samach Tes, Netilas Lulav, Kuf Ayin Shofar, and Kuf Ayin Aleph Machtzis haShekel. So there's clearly a time element in this mitzvah, and it comes from time to time. And that's the Ram himself says here. Mitzvah Kuf Ayin Aleph, mitzvah Ho'achas V'shivim Umeya, He Shetzivonu Loses Machtzis haShekel B'chol Shana. So B'chol Shana. So it's yearly, and I guess all the mitzvahs that are yearly are mentioned here. Sukkah, Lulav, Machtzis here. It's all here. And this also is annually, is Machtzis haShekel. Okay. So that's simple and okay. The problem is, it's easier said than done. I'll explain to you why. Quotes the Rambam B'Posik. Vu Omer Yis'ale, it's the Rebbeinu Shalom, Yis'ale, said the following Posik. V'nosenu ish kreife nafshay l'Hashem b'fkeidoisam. It's a Posik at the beginning of Pashkisisa. It's all very nice, but if you open the Torah and you look at the Psukim, we're talking about what a priori seems to be a rasha, that to give to, when you're counting Bnei Yisrael, everyone should give a Machtzis haShekel. And this mitzvah was terminated in the midbar. And it certainly shouldn't be a minyan on mitzvahs. As the Rambam clearly says in Shiur Shlishi, the mitzvahs which are l'shah are not minyan on mitzvahs. So how does the Rambam do it? It's like a magician's act. He comes and proves. He quotes a pasuk, which is a hilasha, and in that pasuk, there's no element, there's no time element, okay? And true, it says Nesina, but Nesina is to count. And it's a keifa nefesh. It's somehow kapara for the person who's being counted. And he converts that into a mitzvah. He shetivonu loses Machtzis haShekel b'chol shana. And there's no mention of b'chol shana in the pasuk. So this offhand is like a magician's act. We don't know how this happened. So what you're going to have to conclude, we don't know how it happened, is that even though the Pshuter Shalmikla says X, the Matiki Ashmua had a Kabbalah from Moshe Rabbeinu, Pirush Makubal, that the Pasuk, even though Pshuter says X, the Pasuk also has in mind Y. Okay. So that's what has to happen, because the Ram and Shiur Sheni says mitzvahs are basically Torah Shebiksav or Pirush Makubal. So if in Torah Shebiksav it doesn't support it, so that's the Pirush Makubal. Question is, where does it come from? How do we know such a thing? So the Ramban in Shiur Sheni says that there are two purposes of Kisvei HaKodesh. Because you see, we have a Kabbalah, and we'll see about this more. I don't know if it'll be this evening or next week. That Torah Shebiksav, or Nevi'im Ksuvim, we have a general rule that Eila Mitzvas, Malamed Shei Novi, Rashoy L'Chadash Dovo. Mitzvah given to Moshe Rabbeinu. A Novi cannot add a new mitzvah. So the question is, if that's the case, what's the purpose b'chlal of Nevi'im Ksuvim? What's the purpose? So the Ramban in Shirish Beis says there are two purposes in Nevi'im, in Ksuvim. One is they're historians. They will tell you that there was a Takana D'Rabbanan. Takana D'Rabbanan at certain points of Tumas U'Maisris, Takana D'Rabbanan Shvus and Shabbos, Takana D'Rabbanan on Nechemi Mechakalia, Tiltul Kalim, will go on and on to tell you various D'Rabbanans. Then there's another purpose besides that the Nevi'im give you Musa to observe the Torah, Zichru Teras Moshe Avdi. The Nevi'im can put on a different hat. They can wear the hat not of a Novi, which if a Novi says something in the Torah and he says, God told me something, that this is Pshat in Torah, he's a Novi haShekel, and Misasa B'chenek, because Lo Vashamayim he. But the Novi can put on the hat of Matiki Ashmur, that he's the Baal HaMesirah. And what he's doing is not telling you over what God is telling him now, but recanning a Mesirah which the Rebbeinu told Moshe Rabbeinu and given Ish B'Pi Ish. And he's saying over this Mesirah. Now, here, I'll read to you a pasuk, first Divrei Yomim. In Divrei Yomim Beis, what the Goyim call Divrei Yomim Beis, Per Chav Dalet, they call it pasuk Hey and Vav. It says like this: Vayikovets es haKohanim v'aLevim, vayomer lehem. He gathered the Kohanim and Levim, and he said to them, Su'u l'or Yehuda, go out to the cities of Yehuda, v'kivsu mikol Yisrael, kesef lechazik es beis Elokeichem. Get money for to bechazik the beis Elokeichem, the beis HaMikdash. And then it says on it, Midei shana b'shana. It should be yearly. V'atem simaru tmaru l'dovo v'lomi alevim. Vayiko hamelech liyoyoda haroish vayom eloi madua loi darashto es alevim lohavi mi Yehuda umi Yerushalayim. Why you Yoyoda? Why would you machayiv the Levim to go out and collect money from Yehuda Yerushalayim? And then it says, es masas Moshe kisisa es masas Moshe eved Hashem v'akohol v'hakel Yisrael li'oil edus, and bring it for oil. It should be a makel for oil edus. So the question is, he's recording something masas Moshe. So if kisisa es reish b'nei Yisrael kudehem is only a Rosh Hashanah, how can he claim and tell the Levim to go out and collect masas Moshe? So there must be a pirush makubal that something in masas Moshe is noeg l'deres. Now, another pasuk. Now a pasuk in what's in Sefer Ezra, but the Goyim split it into Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's what we have in our thing. Nehemiah Yud pasuk Lamed Gimel Lamed Daled. Behemadnu oleinu mitzvos loses oleinu shlisis haShekel b'shana. There should be a yearly giving of a third of a shekel. La'avodas beis Elokeinu, for avodas beis hamikdash, lelechem hamareches, that's lechem aponim, uminchas atomid, uleoilas atomid, the chavitim, or the minch, sochim, u'ashaboseis achadoshim, lemoadim, ulekochim, ulechatos, lechapa Yisrael, b'chol meleches beis Elokeinu. Meleches beis Elokeinu. So the two psukim in Tanakh, and we'll see about the shlish, why shlish and not chetzi, which are documenting that there's a masas Moshe which exists outside of the purview of Midbar. So comes the Ramban in Chumash. It says like this. In Pash at the beginning, Sisa, in Perek Lamed Pasuk Yud Beis. He says like this. Ushiyesh gam remes b'kroi shel gimel trumas. And one is trumas halishik. Halishik. V'Rabbeinu dorshu mikan sholish trumas miriba mikos. And Chazal darshan that there are three types of truma. V'chein nira, the Ramban says, mima she'oma akosu divrei hayomim beis chav daled vav, what we just read, madua lo darashto al levim lohavi miYehuda Yerushalayim es masas Moshe eved Hashem akol Yisrael lo edus yire mizeh, sagt der Ramban, ki masas Moshe mitzvah l'doros lohavioi lebedek habayis afapi shelo yimnom, even there will be no counting. there's a mitzvah l'deirais to bring money for Berek Habayis. V'chein b'korbonos k'divrei chachomim v'chein kosu ve'amadnu aleinu mitzvos loseis aleinu shlitz haShekel b'shon ha'avodas beis Elkeinu lechem ha'mareches for korbonos minchas hatomid u'lolos hatomid v'shabosim v'chodoshim v'chol meleches beis Elkeinu mikan mufurish shoy mevin shkolim v'chol shona lekorbonos leBerek Habayis. Korbonos, the purpose of shkolim is the korbonos of Berek Habayis, and he explains later about they added to the matbeya, and then therefore it became a shlish instead of a chatzi, and he talks about their chumash. So it means that it's been recorded in Tanakh, this mitzvah. So in Mela, I assume it's a pirush makubal. So this is the source from the Rambam that there's a mitzvah. Very odd that the Rambam doesn't say anything. You know, he's presenting, you see, there's a very strange, there's a presentational issue. You know, it could be what the Ramban is saying true, and it could explain the Rambam. But what the Rambam does is make a statement that there's something l'deres, which is giving Machtzis haShekel, and quoting a pasuk, which is the command, and the pasuk which he quotes has nothing to do with the mitzvah at all, except that the Torah Shebiksav had a pirush makubal that is in the sina of Machtzis haShekel. L'deres. Is it fair on the Rambam's part just to say that there's a mitzvah for Machtzis haShekel b'chol shana and quote a pasuk which in no way, which you look at the pasuk and say dum lo yam, and just to move on without explaining it? True, the pasuk is in Tanakh. That's enough for us that we should be such geniuses to know these two psukim and conclude that this is the pshat in the pasuk in v'nosnu ish kaifa nafshay l'Hashem b'fkoyesam. It's a big finish, to say the least. However, if this is true, that there is a nesina Machtzis haShekel which nothing to do with kaifa nefesh, with koiroisam, then we understand how the Rambam could say that the mitzvah Machtzis haShekel is from 13, not 20, because the mitzvah nothing to do with oival pkudim. It's not being for counting. So it's anyone who's a bar mitzvah. The Rambam says this in Pirush HaMishnah and Shkol and Perek Aleph Mishnah Gimel, and also the passage Shoinoi in Hilchos Shkol and Perek Aleph Halacha Zayin. So even though the mitzvah of the Shah required Ben Esrim, but the mitzvah of Deres is Ben Yud Gimel. This sounds very nice, but it's going to cause us more problems than it solves. We'll see later. Now, this is a very big problem. How do you set up a pasuk for this mitzvah? So there have been other approaches because of this problem. The Abarbanel works very hard and says, you look in Pash Kisisa, it says, Zikaron Lifnei Hashem. And Zikaron Lifnei Hashem is referring to the mitzvah of Deres. That's the Abarbanel and Kisisa says. Okay. He says like this, he says, V'roi shetei l'she'in kesef hashkolim b'mei Moshe omer shikach hakesef b'chule shekoifa nefesh He says, he calls there Nichla Bavrisol Moed. K'moy she's boy besay the pekude. Omnom Amru Eid v'hoy lebnei Yisrael lezikol lifnei Hashem. Hu inyan acher nema al hashkolim Yisrael achar kach b'chol dor v'dor yitnu b'chol shona shebehem yizochu lifnei Hashem v'yiu lechape al nafshei seichem. So there's a kapara in shekel. Okay, and a new pasuk. Okay, say it. He doesn't quote it in Medrash Chazal that he found this, but this is what he suggests. The Rash Seuleo in Psicha to Yerushalmi Shkolim learns the mitzvah from the pasuk in the beginning pasuk Truma. V'yicholi Truma. Okay, very nice. That's a mitzvah day. It's a big chiddush. The Gaon in Adei Yisrael learns the mitzvah, and he says, Rabbi Yisai, the mitzvah is not from any posik. It's halacha l'Shmiyas. It's a Messiah. And then you say, the Nevi'im are expressing the Messiah. A priori, this would be the best approach, but the good. The problem is, the Ram has locked himself into a position that mitzvahs are based on psukim and Torah shebiksav. So he can't do this because halacha l'Shmiyas is pure, unadulterated Torah shebal peh and cannot be a source of a mitzvah. It can tell you dinim that come from Sinai, but can't tell you mitzvahs. So the Rambam is forced to choose and make the choice that he did. Now, I want to tell you the problem. Continues the Rambam and says, B'chol shona v'shona. So, B'chol shona v'shona. And he also says, V'nosnu ish keifa nafshal Hashem b'fkoireisam. V'yom zeh yitnu. V'hi mavua, or it's boro, shemitzvah zo ein hanoshim chayeves bo. Sha'kosuv hu kol ho'ev ala pekudim. Kol ho'ev b'pekudim means all those you counted. And in the Mishkan, you only counted the male and not a female. So it means noshim apota. But this don't make no sense, excuse the double negative. Because if the mitzvah is based on Torah shebiksav, then it's only harashah. And so we say that it's based on the Pirush Mekup Moshe Rabbeinu. But it's not counting, right? It's just giving money for shkolim. For whatever you're giving it for, we'll see. But if that's the case, who's chayiv? A ben yud gimel, not a ben chav. You don't need a ben chav. Why? Because it's not pekudim. There's no pekida. It's just a nesina. And since a ben yud gimel is bar mitzvah, he has these mechayiv mitzvahs. He has to give. But how can you, in one hand, say that you don't need a ben chav and learn there's a p'tur noshim in the mitzvah machs haShekel? It's very odd what the Rambam is doing. Now, next. If you recall, the Ramban was very prolific. What you do, what the Nesina is for. He says Nesina is for Berek Abayis and for Korbanos. Rav Sadigoy, he also has a mitzvah, and he also puts it in the mitzvah zmanim. And I could imagine the Ram felt he didn't have to prove anything because the Goyim accepted it. and what's a general common acceptance, he doesn't have to prove, maybe. And maybe that's why he's not talking so much. Comes Rav Sadiga in Perek Chav, on page 200, the end of Perek Chav. Perek Chav, you understand, is the Perek, a Perek of Esrim Mitzvas HaChagim, Vehein Arboim. Chagim, I know it's Chagim. V'tziva al kol Yehudi min ha'gvorim, it's only male. B'chol shana, loses, machs, loses, I guess the person is assuming that. Machs haShekel, mikesev l'korbanos. K'fi she'omar, ze yitnu kol oiva al pkudi machs haShekel b'shekel ha'kodesh. And he has no problem. And he feels the pasuk is enough. But he says l'korbanos. So again, so Ramban said the mitzvah is the berek abayis and l'korbanos. Rav Sadiga says l'korbanos. Let's see what the Rambam does. The Rambam does like this. The Rambam seems to assume that Machs haShekel is a mitzvah sina, and he gives no clue of what you're giving the money for. And it could be because la b'dafka l'korbanos, and the tzibur could be machlit what it should be used for. Because he writes the mitzvah in all places. Minyan mitzvahs here, minyan hakotzer, protei mitzvahs, and in Mishnah Torah and Halachos, he says the sina. There's a mitzvah the sina machs haShekel. No rhyme or reason what you're giving it for. And I would assume the reason why this is so is because it's lav daf with Trumas Halishka, which is korbanos, and maybe Tzolkei HaMikdash Yerushalayim, which we'll see in Mitzvah Hashem. It could be you brought it, and the Rambam Perek Beis Halacha Daled tells you the dinim of the Lishka. He says, B'chol Medina, Perek Beis Halacha Daled, Shkolim, B'chol Medina, Kishegoyim HaShkolim, Mishulchan, Mishalchin Oison, Biyad Shluchim, Lemikdosh, V'yesh Lahem L'tzaref Oison, V'chule. And then, Ashi Skabsu Shom, Sholish Kupas Gedolos, Shiur kol kupa kedei shetochel teshav soyin v'hasham enichin oisam b'lishka v'zeh shebetoch hakupas or neko trumas alishka. There's trumas alishka and shori alishka. And then in Perek Dalet halacha aleph zayin ches, he tells you what you do with these things. Trumas alishka ma'yasebo lo chimenu tmidim shal kol yoyim musafim v'chulei. Nisachin, Melach, Shemochem bo Karbonis, Eitzim, Kteres, Schartes, Lechem Aponim, Scharois Lechem Aponim, Oime, Shtei Alechem, Por Adumo, Siyam Eshkaleach, and he continues. V'chein, and V'chein, he says, excuse me, Magis form Shivishalaim, Notlim Schom Chumas Alishka. Dayonim, Shedonnes Agazlon Biyushalayim, Notlim Schom Chumas Alishka. Bekamo Hoy Notlim Chule. Then he says, Kevish Hoy Boinin Meharabayis lahara mishcha, she'olov moitziin poraduma, v'chein oyoisen kevesh, she'moitziin olov siyam mishalech, u'shneim, mishore alishka, v'chein mizbeach lo'ilo. The Mizbach lo'il, Mizbeach, haShekel, v'azos, the structure of the Mikdash, nasim mishore alishka. Amas hamayim shiv Yushalayim, choymas Yushalayim, v'chol migdalei seah, v'chol tzorchei boy mishore alishka. And he says, this I think is the proof over here. V'goy shenisnade mois l'dvorim ho'elu, oy shisnadiv la'aseis imohem b'chinom ein mekabel mimenu v'afilu ger toshav shenema lo lochem v'lonu livnois beis Elokeinu. Although the tafkid from the money from the Trumas Alishka or the Shor Alishka is livnois beis bais le'Elokeinu. V'nema v'lochem ein chelek utztoko v'zichron b'Yushalayim. It's something about Jerusalem, the Beis HaMikdash, and a goy can't have a chelik, and that's what's going on in the Shkolim. And I would suggest that that's the Lashon Lechinuch. He doesn't say that it's a mitzvah, that the korbanah should come from this, or the and that's what the chefs of a Machtzis haShekel of a korbanos of binyan habayis. He says hoyu. It means it's a historical note. That's what they did it for, but there's no dinim. The Chinuch says in Mitzvah Kufhei, Shiten kol echod mi Yisrael ben esrim shana v'mayla. Discuss the Rambam. The Ramban is also like the Rambam. Bein oni bein oshi Machtzis haShekel shuhu mishkal whatever b'chol shana liyad kohanim shenema ze yitnu kol oiva pkudim. V'hoyu manichin hakol b'lishka achas shebemikdash umishom hoyu motziin liknois tmidim musafim v'chol korban hakorev al hatzibo v'niskeim v'chule v'chule v'chule. It's just hoyu. It's a historical note, but it's not a din. It's that the mitzvah mechayev. Okay. So l'cheira, I would have assumed that even the etzem trumas halishka, the truma itself, is not a deraisa dikadin. It just that's the way they would convey it. There's nothing in the Kabbalah that says anything about trumas halishka. The Ram just says tam, and he quotes all the dinim much later than when he's talking about the mitzvah. Because what the mitzvah is in the Sina, and then he talks about the lishka, and in Perek, in the middle of Perek Beis, and in Perek Daled, he talks about the dinim of the truma and the shoya. The truma is the shoya lishka, but it doesn't say that's the mitzvah. It's a tesefta, a very interesting tesefta. The Sefer says in Perek Gimel of Shkolim, towards the end, in some editions it's Chav Gimel, but I assume it's a lot earlier late in the other editions. V'nei ma omru Shkolim ein noegin ele b'fnei habayis. Why is the mitzvah Shkolim oin noeg b'zman shebeis hamikdash kayim lefi she'ein tomin min hayisham? It's something about the truma. So you get the impression for this after that the truma is a chalashem deraisa, and therefore you potter for the mitzvah because there's no lishka and there's no truma lishka. But according to the Ram, this is completely out of context because the mitzvah is stamis, and I assume there's no deraisa dikadin from truma. Maybe I'm wrong. So l'cheira, if since it's okay on mikdash in Yerushalayim according to the Rambam, you could say in mikdash is no mitzvah. But then it's not like the Sefer. We have to understand where the Rambam's coming from. Okay, Mitzvah Shem will pick up next week.